including physical disabilities, physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, sensory disabilities, which is the category that mine fits into, mental illness, and basically any long-term condition that results in a restriction in everyday activities. So it's more diverse, and I certainly cannot speak for every single disabled person because we're all individuals. We have different experiences and we have different preferences. There are many disabled people in academia, but most of them are not very visible, and that's because they're not openly comfortable declaring their disability. The reasons for this are variable, but they are largely due to concerns about discrimination. And in fact, even though I openly declare my disability to anyone who comes into my lab as a potential candidate, whether that be a student or a staff member, I have had a student and I've also had a staff member who have had disabilities. One of them was dyslexic and the other one actually was deaf in one ear. And despite me declaring openly my disability, they were not comfortable in sharing their own until they'd started in the lab. And I do find that concerning because I'm a very open and friendly person. And I understand that it's just the way they are, that they've learned to hide it. And I'm hopeful that in the future, less people will want to hide it. Having a disability does not mean we're not as capable. We certainly are. We just do things differently to overcome what our disability puts in place, obstacles that we have to overcome. And our disabilities might present barriers, but these are often less of an obstacle than bias. And bias has certainly been an obstacle in my career, a major obstacle. So please be aware of your bias and also how it affects others, because it certainly does. So let's start on my personal journey. So as I mentioned before, we really are not sure when my hearing loss occurred, but I had a life-threatening incident when I was 3. I was diagnosed with appendicitis, but by the time I got to the hospital, I come from a small country town and there were no medical facilities in my town, so they had to take me to the nearest town, which was an hour's drive away. That was Swan Hill, and they thought I had appendicitis. They removed my appendix, and then they discovered that I had an intestinal abscess, and that's much harder to treat. They actually didn't give me a very good chance of survival. They told my parents not to get their hopes up, that I was very sick and I had a long way to go. So I was in hospital for 3 weeks. I had tubes draining the poison from my body. And then what happens is that if you've had your body open, an open wound for a long time like that, they can't stitch you up normally. They have to do these loose stitches. I've got a very ugly scar on my body, my abdomen, and I can actually see where they stitched me up, the different stitch marks. And you get given high-dose antibiotics so that you don't get an infection while you're recovering. And they think that, and we only really realized this in 2018, my mother actually was told that it was probably due to bronchial pneumonia when she was pregnant with me, but my voice, my speech is too well developed for someone who's had a profound loss like this to have had it in utero. So we actually think that that was most likely the incident that caused my hearing loss. So this is an audiogram, and I use this for teaching purposes because I teach to the Deaf and Communication Unit at Melbourne Uni every year. And so I asked my audiologist if she could generate an audiogram that included all the different sounds, which would help to explain what it means to my hearing. So for those of you who have ever done an audiogram, or for not, actually what you do is you get put in a soundproof room, you get put headphones, and you get a button to press. And what you have to do is when you hear the sound, you press your button. And so what they do is they increase it from low to high frequencies. So I'm getting my pointer here, it's disappeared. So from low to high frequencies here, and then from soft to loud volume. And when you hear it, when they record it, and so you can see here in the low frequencies, I've got slight hearing loss in both ears, and then it drops to a very profound hearing loss here. I cannot hear high frequencies at all. So these are the sounds that I cannot hear normally. I cannot hear T, H, S, F, K, S, H, G, H, C, H, P, R, and even some of the vowels very well, A, O, and I. And then these are the sounds that I can hear, but obviously I don't have any normal hearing anymore. My hearing did used to be much better when I was younger at the normal low frequencies, but it has deteriorated over time, and we understand the reason for that now as well. So the impact of this is I cannot hear whispers. I've never been able to hear whispers to my memory. And prior to my first cochlear implant, and I'll speak about that in a bit, I could only repeat 6% of words correctly without lip reading, and I was guessing a lot of them. So I lip read, I'm very good at lip reading, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. I cannot follow conversations in noisy environments. So while I'm a very social person, I like people, I like talking with people and everything, it makes it harder for me to be social in networking instance and in noisy environments. And although my voice has changed dramatically since I've had my cochlear implants, it used to sound very, very different. It used to be very pitchy, and also it sounded more like a European type of an accent. And people thought that I had a foreign accent. That was one of the first things that people would ask me when they met me, and after talking to them for a bit, they'd say, "Where do you come from?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm Australian. I was born in Australia, brought up in Australia, and my accent is a speech defect." So I was diagnosed in not in 1972, actually. I was diagnosed later than 1972, but we think that 1972, which is when I was 3 and I had this life-threatening incident, that's when I lost my hearing. I do remember having very painful ear infections, and that likely contributed to the loss as well. But by the time I was 5, my mother noticed that I did not respond to her if I had my back to her, for example, when I was watching TV. So she drove me to the closest ENT, which was in Mildura, almost a 2-hour drive each way from my hometown, which is called Balranald in southern New South Wales. And he tested my low frequencies, and he said there was nothing wrong with my hearing, that she was just imagining things, and he sent us home. So when I was 8, an audiologist visited our town school. My mother was a primary school teacher, and she asked the audiologist if she could test my hearing. And she tested it thoroughly and discovered that I had no high frequencies. So my mother drove us back to Mildura, and again, he initially just tested my low frequencies and said there was nothing wrong. And then my mother insisted that he test my highs, and he discovered that I had no high frequencies. He said, well, at the moment, there's no hearing aids for her condition, but she'll be fine. She just won't appreciate classical music. So there was a bit of a miscommunication between the ENT and my parents. And so I actually did not have hearing assessments for a long time. In fact, between the age of 12 and 19, I did not have any hearing assessments at all. My teachers were told that I had a hearing loss, and so they thought that it was being adequately treated and monitored, but it wasn't. And I had no assistance at school, so I taught myself to lip read. And I just studied hard, and I actually excelled at school. I had the marks to do medicine, but chose to do science. So it certainly didn't stop me from doing anything that I loved, and I do love learning, and I love, I always apply myself very highly in everything I do. And ironically, despite being told that I would not appreciate classical music, I actually do. I love music. I used to play the piano, and I sang in the school choirs until the end of year 11. And I went to boarding school for the last 4 years, and we had a madrigal choir in my school, and that actually competed at a Stedfords. There was only about 8 of us in the madrigal choir. It was unaccompanied, and we used to win a Stedfords against adults. So we were really good. It was really a nice experience. So in terms of my life as a person with a profound hearing loss, while I have a visible disability, many people do not notice my hearing aids previously, and now my cochlear implants, and you can see here, you cannot see it. take one off now and show you. So this is the processor. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so I was actually thinking that once I have my cochlear implants, people would notice them, but my hair actually covers it, and it's not deliberately. I thought that they would be able to notice it, but it doesn't matter anyway. And because of this, people think that I hear perfectly well. And so they stare at me when I do not respond to them when I should. And they think I'm rude, I guess, because I don't respond to them when I should. And they also stare at me because my voice is loud. It's probably not quite as loud as it used to be, but I suspect it's still quite loud. And it becomes louder in noisy situations because I can't hear myself. So I'm speaking up louder to hear myself. And people think I'm rude because I talk too much on platforms like Zoom, and I'm consciously trying to reduce this. And that's because, well, in the past, I didn't hear people as well. It's much better now. We've got platforms that help, and I'm Bluetoothing to my cochlear implants today. And I tend not to ask people too much about themselves in social settings, in noisy ones, because I cannot hear or understand them properly. And I tend to talk more about myself, my life, and that could probably give an inadequate representation of me. And all of these are common traits of people with profound hearing loss. And because I wasn't brought up in a disabled community, I wasn't brought up in a deaf school, I wasn't aware that, you know, this is what it's commonly a common trait. And it was only once I started presenting at Melbourne Uni to the Deaf and Communication unit that I actually understood a bit more about my own traits, because I will stay for the half hour of the session that I'm not presenting in, and I'll learn a bit more about things myself. So it's been really quite nice for me. So in terms of my career, the main content I get from presentations is the information on the slides, and live captioning helps. That's one good thing about the pandemic, is that Zoom presentations has become more common. Not everyone does make them accessible, but I've learned to advocate for that. And our biggest conferences in my field, which are the International Society for Experimental Hematology and now ASH, are actually making live captioning available because of my advocacy. So that's a nice benefit. I haven't experienced a huge amount of discrimination that I have noticed, but I did experience a significant case of discrimination in my third year of university. So I actually got my first pair of hearing aids when I was 19 in second year uni. And that's because I have tinnitus all the time. And a friend of mine had said that she had tinnitus all the time and went to an ENT, and he said that she needed grommets. And I thought, well, I've got tinnitus all the time. Maybe that's my problem. So I went to an ENT and he said, oh, you need hearing aids. And so that was how it came around that I actually even got my first pair of hearing aids. And hearing aids for my condition, they improved a little bit. I could actually hear cicadas for the first time, and I'd never heard them before. And I thought my hearing aids were blowing up every time I walked past a place that had cicadas. But it really didn't provide me with a huge amount of benefit. And the government assisted aids were worse than my hearing aids that we bought privately. But my private hearing aids, the government didn't have any assistance for them. So I had to use government provided hearing aids at university, which hooked up to a device that kind of looks like a small recorder. And there was a microphone that your lecturer was supposed to wear, and that transmitted to the device that transmitted to my hearing aids. And one of my lecturers did not want to wear this microphone. And so even though he was aware it wasn't providing and you know, me with an advantage, if anything, I was still disadvantaged compared to all the other students, he just didn't want to wear it for some reason. And in fact, at one point in time, it got to the point where he embarrassed me in front of the entire class and got angry and yelled at me. And so I decided to go and visit him in his office, away from all the other students. And when I walked in, he said, well, I'm glad you've arrived. I've just been on the phone to the Equal Opportunity Committee because they didn't have a disability community back then. This was in the late 80s. And I said, oh, that's interesting. What did they say? And he said, well, I couldn't get onto them, but I've decided to wear your device. So that was my major issue of discrimination. But it's also, disappointing that people don't realize that just enabling accessibility makes a big difference, and it doesn't give an advantage over anyone else. I actually started openly declaring my disability in my career in academia more openly after an incident when I was doing a postdoc tour, and I gave a seminar in Seattle. And after I had presented, people were asking questions. It was a dark room, the lights were off. And so I said, look, I'm happy to answer questions, but could we please turn the lights back on? And could you please put your hand up if you're asking me a question? I have a profound hearing impairment and I need to lip read. And so after that, a man who knew me, he came up to me and he said, oh, that's a good one. You don't have a hearing impairment. And I showed him my hearing aids and the look of shock on his face. And he said, oh, I never knew. And he said, you had it well. And in fact, once I started presenting more regularly, getting oral presentations and everything, I did declare it up front. I even asked the chairs at the session, and one of the chairs had known me since I was a postdoc in Seattle. So she'd known me for at least 5 years, and she said, I never knew. So I think it's really important to declare it. I had no issues with declaring it, and I realize now too that it's also important for the disabled community to see a disabled person declaring their disability. So I'm quite happy to do that. And I'm not ashamed of it. And I think that's also something that other people are not really ashamed of their disability, but they're worried about what declaring their disability will do to their career. And as Stephen Hawking said, disability need not be an obstacle to success. So I want to go briefly through my roller coaster research career. So I did my research. My initial project was in microenvironment. I had a supervisor who was studying megakaryocytes, the platelet precursor cells, and he was really interested in determining whether or not the bone marrow endothelial cells had a role in regulating these cells. So this was 30 years ago now, and my project was a very challenging one, and actually no one can do what I was trying to do even now without immortalizing the endothelial cells, and that was trying to isolate and grow the bone marrow endothelial cells. So these are endothelial cells from bone marrow. You can grow endothelial cells from a lot of organs quite readily, but the bone marrow endothelial cells are very, very difficult to grow. And there have been 2 papers published by one independent research group in Seattle and saying that they could grow them. And that was how my PhD came about. It's based on their papers. Unfortunately, they didn't include appropriate controls, and their cells were actually 2 different types of macrophages in the bone marrow. And so it was a very challenging, a very difficult project, and it was also in a lab that wasn't equipped for this project. In fact, PACS wasn't really even available at the time, and there were no markers to identify the bone marrow endothelial cells to pull them out. So it was a lot of culturing. I used to go to the abattoir to get cow aortas to isolate endothelial cells from them as one of my controls, even though they're not perfect. And it was a lot of hard work, and my supervisor really wasn't able to guide me in it either. So actually during my PhD, I applied for and was successful in obtaining a bursary from the British Council, which enabled me to go and study for 6 months in the labs of Terry Allen and Mark Dexter. Mark is now known for being the head of the Wellcome Trust for a long time, but they actually pioneered studies called long-term bone marrow cultures. And so they were one of the only groups in the world that were working on microenvironment cells at the time. And I was able to spend 6 months of my PhD there, which was fantastic. And it also gave me an opportunity to attend some conferences. And at the first conference, which was a physiology conference in Glasgow, I met Tudor Folkman. He was presenting his work on endothelial cells. And at the end of his presentation, he mentioned that they were interested in studying bone marrow endothelial cells. So as a enthusiastic young PhD student, I went up to him after his talk, told him how much I enjoyed it, and mentioned that that's exactly what I was working on. And he became very excited, and he invited me to spend a week in the lab in Boston, and he said he would pay for me to go over there. And I thought, I'm just a PhD student. I'm not, I'm not experienced investigator or anything. And I was thinking he's not going to do it. But I went directly from there to another conference, and that was on experimental hematology in Rotterdam. And I mentioned to the man in Seattle whose work I was trying to reproduce that Professor Folkman had invited me to Boston. And he said, well, if he does, then I'll invite you to Seattle from there, and I'll pay for you to come over from there. And I got back to Manchester and discovered this invitation from Professor Folkman. Email wasn't really, it was just starting out, and this was a fax, and it all happened. So I went to Boston for a week and spent a week in Professor Folkman's lab, and then I went to Seattle for a week, and I lined up my postdoc in Seattle. And that was in a woman's lab, and she was one of the only people working on microenvironment cells. That was a difficult time for me. She treated me poorly, and it took me a long time to work out why. And despite getting a first author blood paper within the first year of being in her lab, and I was corresponding author on that paper, in early 1996, she didn't get enough funding to continue to keep me on. But she also tried to prevent me from getting another job in Seattle, which was something that I didn't understand, and it took me a long time to work it out. In fact, in 2018, finally worked that one out. But it had a significant effect on me. And I was lucky that I was offered a job in Seattle at the Hutch, and it was a completely different postdoc. It was not working on microenvironment cells, which was my background, and it was a joint position between Bernstein and Steve Collins. So I was based in Irv's lab. He wanted to set up the mouse stem cell assays to look at the effects of Notch on hematopoietic stem cell self-renewal. But I was working on a retinoid project, which was Steve's. And so because I was in Irv's lab, Steve didn't think I was his postdoc. And because I was working on retinoic acid, Irv didn't think I was his postdoc. So they basically left me alone. I presented at lab meetings, and I developed the project myself. I also set up the mouse HSCs system, and I learned a lot about stem cells in the process. And when it was time for me to leave, I was able to take all of the work with me. And this was very successful. And I identified something very unexpected, that all-trans retinoic acid, which is used to treat patients with acute myeloid, with acute promyelocytic leukemia, actually does the opposite to stem cells. It enhances the self-renewal. And that's been independently shown by another group as well, only recently, and they got a better impact paper than me too. So that was a bit of a problem. But anyway, in late 2000, we have another bit of a downer. I was recruited back to Australia with the promise of a lab. And as many underrepresented academics treated, I was not mentored at all. And if I had been mentored, I would have got everything in writing, but I didn't. I trusted the person who recruited me back, and I transferred my fellowship. And when I arrived back, I was told that I was a senior postdoc in this person's lab. And I actually had applied for funding prior to coming back. And while I missed out on my NHMRC application, I did get a Cancer Victoria grant. And that enabled me to hire a research assistant and start my own independent group. So while I was based in this man's lab, I was never promoted to lab head, and we'll get back to that in a bit. So I actually left in mid-2004 and went to Boston, partly for personal reasons, because I had met my husband, my now husband, but also because I was not happy where I was and I was not being treated very well. And so what I did do, though, is because I had a lot of funding at the time, I had more funding than most of the lab heads at that institute, I made a deal with them that I would keep my funding until the end of 2005 when it ran out. And what I did was I went home every 3 months, and I also supervised them all every day by email, as well as setting up new experiments and helping others in their own research, and formed a collaboration with someone who also led me back into more microenvironment and into bone work. And actually we had already focused on microenvironment as well, because when I went back to Australia, I started working on the roles of the retinoic acid receptors and made an unexpected finding that turned into a cell senior author paper. And so in 2007, just before I moved back from Boston, I had a cell senior author paper and also a co-author cell paper. And that cell senior author paper was largely done by me. The work was largely done by me. I wrote the manuscript, yet people credited it to either David or to my husband. And this is just an example of bias, and it has impacted my career. And in 2008, my husband and I independently chose to come back to SBI. That was our first preference. We reached out to them, and then I had some success in terms of getting an NHMRC CDA2 and Senior Research Fellow. I had 2 CIA NHMRCs, not concurrently, but back to back. And I was promoted to Associate Director at SBI in 2010, and also Associate Professor that same year. Between 2013 to 2016, I had a significant funding shortage. It was a really, really tough time for me. And my SRF was not renewed at the end of the first 5 years of that grant. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. From 2017 onwards, funding's been a bit better. I'm not going to say it's fantastic. I'm still going through a bit of a tough funding time, and I've understood that this is really what happens to a lot of underrepresented academics, and it's just made me use my voice to advocate more openly for it as well, and to stop this inequity. So if we look at the downs, for a long time I didn't understand why this woman treated me as she did, and she treated me very, very poorly. And her husband was very prominent at this institute. So even though I did go to HR and talk to them about it, they said that there was nothing that I could do anyway, because her husband had so much power. So when I was recruited back and not promoted, and I was not promoted at all to lab head, even though I was independently running my own group, I had a team of people, students and staff and postdocs. And the reason that they gave me for not being promoted was that I didn't have enough publications. Yet a man with fewer publications, only 2, and it wasn't that they were better quality than mine either, did get promoted. And I wasn't the only woman who was treated that way. I found that out recently. And many people were supportive of me and tried to get me promoted, and I do appreciate that. So I would like to highlight that. So the lesson learned from this is, first of all, get everything in writing. Don't trust people. You might think that, you know, they're wonderful and that they're going to deliver, but they don't always deliver. And also women are treated differently to men. So in 2007, I said I had my first son, moved back to Australia in 2008, and in 2010 I had my second son. Took me obviously a while to get going again. Once I got back to Australia, I didn't get much startup money at all. That's the way things were. And I was working really, really, really hard and burning out. And I did have a clinical trial that came out of the work that I started when I got back, and it was a really extensive project. And I was doing all these leadership things. I was on the International Society for Experimental Hematology Board of Directors, doing all these leadership things at SBI. And for my track record leadership score from one of my 2 primary assessors that you get before you went to an interview was a score of 4 out of 7, despite all this leadership and despite my publications and despite having a clinical trial. And it was because of that score of 4 that I did not receive my 6-year funding. So most other people got a 6th year and I didn't, because it wasn't a 5. Everything else was 5 or above, and I did not. And so the lesson learned from this is that NHMRC career disruptions are not working. And I know that there are many, many other people who have had similar experiences, although I don't know if they've had an experience in terms of the 6-year funding, but I know that career disruptions are just not taken seriously. Or as Andrew Roberts said, and he saw a version of this talk prior to me first giving it in front of my peers in 2018, as he said, shit happens. So we go back to Seattle and the woman, and I really didn't understand until 2018, and I finally worked it out. And I was very fortunate because I actually visited Seattle that year, and I was able to sit down and talk with her about it. And she was 70, and she started crying, and she said, "I'm glad you figured it out a lot earlier than I did, because it's ruined my career and it's ruined my life." And she had experienced significant gender discrimination. In fact, she'd even had sexual harassment, and she'd internalized it. And internalized misogynism is something we don't talk about much. We talk about women being really horrible to other women and men, but often it's a reflection of how they've been treated and how they've internalized that treatment. And it is a significant mental health issue. And I do think that we need to recognize it, we need to treat it, and we need to prevent it from happening. So the lesson learned from that is to communicate your story and don't internalize it. And it is difficult to communicate a personal story. The first time I gave my presentation in 2018 was the most difficult talk I'd ever given in my life. It's become a bit easier, but it still is hard. And there are people who will never want to share their personal story, and that's understandable. But if people do, please make sure that they're comfortable, that they're in a safe environment, and that they know that they're being supported, because it is very, very difficult to do this. People always say that you can't be what you can't see. And while I understand where they're coming from, I completely disagree with them, because someone always has to be the first. In terms of me, I am the first academic in my family. And I've done a lot of firsts in other things. And I just think that being the first brings additional responsibilities to make it a smoother roller coaster ride for others. And while it can be hard at times, and it comes at a risk of my own career, I have learned to advocate, and I will continue to advocate. So I'm the first academic in my family. I'm also the first person to get my PhD from my hometown. They gave me an Australia Day Award for that in 1996. And so I've been a role model for the children in my town for a very long time. I'm also the most senior basic science researcher in hematology in Australia in terms of years post-PhD. I have never had a senior role model who was a woman in Australia. My senior role models are overseas. My biggest one is Connie Eaves in Canada, and she herself has had a very, very challenging career, and she's done amazing things. I'm also the first Australian woman to receive the McCulloch-Quintel Award from ISCH this year. It was received for my contributions to research. So I've pioneered 2 different things. I've shown that all-trans retinoic acid enhances HSC self-renewal. I've pioneered 3 things really: that the retinoic acid receptors have different roles in regulating hematopoiesis, and that's led to clinical trials with RAR-specific ligands. And I've also shown that the microenvironment can significantly contribute to blood cell diseases, and that's still a hot topic today. And Mark Dawson is the only other awardee in Australia, and it just shows the calibre of these awards. These are not minor awards. If you look at the list of people who've had them and what they've done, I mean, really amazing company. And I've done this with very little funding. And I'm also one of the very few academics in Australia who openly declares a disability. There are some of us who do it. Some do it more because it's a very obvious physical disability. I do mine because I'm not embarrassed about my disability. And if people want to penalize me for my disability, that's their loss, not mine. People with disabilities are not accounted for in our funding system. And if you look at the profile page here, you can see their personal. We have male, we have female, not stated, intersex, or indeterminate. Now, this is supposed to capture non-binary. We have a non-binary member on our team now who has said that this is not adequate. And in fact, I can tell you, because I've done most of the analysis of the data that has been presented around Australia with the gender equity work, is that no one ticks intersex or indeterminate sex. They all tick not stated. And other is the best for non-binary, and we're hoping that NHMRC and ARC will change it to that. You can tick your citizenship country, obviously, But that's not reported at all in any of the funding outcomes. And also, the most important thing is whether or not you're Indigenous. I do think that that's really important to declare and to report and to look at and monitor. But there are no other personal attributes that we are collecting, and we are not reporting on the majority of them anyway. And this is important. When I applied for an NIH grant successfully when I was in USA in David's group, I had the option to declare my disability. I remember being really surprised that I was asked if I had a disability I wanted to declare. And 18 years later, I still cannot declare it within HMRC. And I'm also aware that ARC are the same, and also other funding agents. And other underrepresented groups also likewise very important to include. And it's not just about collecting data of your citizenship, it's also your ethnicity. They're two different things. And I do find that looking at the data, we have a very multicultural country. We know that there's a very multicultural mix in the very early career stages of fellowships. And as they become more senior, well, that disappears as well. So that's a concern. We have advocated to NHMRC to do that, and they've said they don't know what they will do with the data. Well, we do, I can tell you that much. It's time for change. Change is needed, and change is for the better, and we do need to ensure that everyone is treated with equity. And many are resistant to change, and I can understand that, and I'm going to come back to my disability and tell you about my resistance to change, because I was resistant to having a cochlear implant for over 10 years. So despite that loss that I've shown you and telling you about the impact of it, I love music and I love pure sounds. And I knew that having a cochlear implant would be a very different way of hearing. And it is, it's certainly very different. And for that very reason, I didn't want to have a cochlear implant for over 10 years. It wasn't initially available to me when I was diagnosed when I was 19, and development over the years has meant that it's more open for people with profound loss like mine, where hearing aids really do not bring much benefit at all. But in 2018, I experienced an episode of sudden hearing loss, and what that happened, what that did is it made my low frequencies that were slight hearing loss drop down to moderate. And it really made it very, very difficult for me to have conversations with people. And it made me realize that I needed to do something because it would affect my career. So I was put on high-dose steroids, and that helped to get my hearing loss back. But we also think that I've had it for over 10 years. I've had a condition called an acoustic neuroma, which is a benign tumor that affects hearing imbalance. It was diagnosed by an MRI after my sudden hearing loss episode, because that's known, that's one known thing that causes sudden hearing loss. And it's only tiny. So even though I had an MRI 10 years prior for unexplained headaches, they didn't detect it. But when my ENT pulled up those records and had a look, knowing what to look for, she actually could see that there was evidence of it then as well. So we do think that that's caused more of hearing loss throughout my life. We don't know how long I've had it. It's very tiny. We do need to monitor it, but it is benign. The only thing that can affect my life is if it does get larger. If it gets too large, then we'll need to treat it, because it actually can be life-threatening. And it can cause issues with balance. I'm lucky I haven't had any issues with balance. And even if it is active, and it's hard to know when it's active, even if it causes more permanent hearing loss, it doesn't matter, because with a cochlear implant, you lose most of your natural hearing anyway. And that's exactly what happened with me. But I decided to have my first cochlear implants, and because at that time I was nearly 50, so I had had my hearing loss for almost 47 years. There were no guarantees of the outcome, because I have done a lot of research, and I'm aware of this research because I would present to the audiologist at Melbourne Uni as well. And so I was asked to go and talk about my hearing loss. And then when I was about to have my cochlear implant, They asked if I would go pre-cochlear implant and post-cochlear implant. And so I got to learn a lot about cochlear implants then as well. And so I knew going into my cochlear implant that the chances of me having a very successful implant were quite slim. And luckily for me, I've been a bit of an outlier. It's a long road to adjustment. When they show videos of people getting switched on, particularly children, you see these smiling faces, and I certainly smiled. I started laughing actually. You can't understand speech automatically. It takes a very long time and a lot of practice. You can hear sounds though, and for me it was just amazing what I could hear. I could hear rainbow lorikeets, I could hear squeaky shoes, I could hear clothes rustling, all these sounds that I'd never heard before that you take for granted if you have perfect hearing. And unfortunately for me, the implant was a success. And last year, the same day we went into lockdown number 5, I went into surgery. We went in lockdown, I came out of surgery and was told that we were in lockdown. I had my second cochlear implant, and that's also been very successful. So I'm going to talk about a cochlear implant. I've shown you the external processor here. But what happens is they cut behind your ear, and they insert this part here around here. And then this is the actual cochlear implant itself, and it gets inserted into your cochlea. And you can see it looped around here. There are 22 channels here. They're doing the work of thousands of hair cells. So you can imagine that it's a very, very different way of hearing, and it takes a long time to adjust to hearing, and some people never do. And then the external magnet here attaches, so clips onto the head here, and then this is the processor that looks like a hearing aid, and I just put it over my ears. So as I mentioned, I was very persistent. I trained a lot. I did my exercises, and it paid off. So my ability to understand speech without lip reading is significantly improved, and it's made it a lot easier for me in the pandemic talking with people who have masks, although I still do rely a bit on lip reading. So as I said before, my cochlear implant with my hearing aids alone and not being able to lip read, I got 6% of words correct, guessing. And at 3 months post second cochlear implant with both of my cochlears on, I get 60% of words correct, and that's confidently. And that increases to 80% when you think about words that I don't get right, but I get the sound right. And what that means is that I can still interpret sentences much, much more easily than I did in the past. So it's really made a big significant change, and my voice has changed significantly. It started changing within the first week of being switched on. So it's really been amazing. So cochlear implants have significantly improved my quality of life. My cochlear implants Bluetooth to my phone. I can follow most telephone conversations, Zoom, etc. I don't tell my mum that I can hear on the phone now because she loves talking on the phone. I can repeat a significant number of sentences in noisy backgrounds without lip reading. And I do not experience constant tinnitus, ringing of the ears when I have my implants on. And while synthetic, initially the sounds are still very natural, and I still love music. And so change has definitely been for the better for me. And it is time for change. We need to think about a new normal. We talk about a new normal post-pandemic, although we're still through a pandemic. It's time for a new normal in academia as well. And it's time to break down all the barriers and improve equity for all. We can definitely contribute. We make amazing, major contributions, and I can guarantee that change is for the better. And on the topic of change, I'm just going to take a few more, a little bit more time to talk about making presentations more accessible, because we don't talk about this, but a lot of the ways that people are now taught to make oral presentations is actually making it more inaccessible to people with a range of disabilities. And so people are trying to keep presentations very simple, less text, more pictures, and that makes it less accessible to people like me, particularly with the hearing. And numerous disabilities are now not accommodated well by the minimalist presentation styles that are favoured. And so I've learned a bit about this, and I try to advocate for this as well. So 1 in 7 people have a hearing disability. So it's a very common hearing loss as well. It's not because of aging, it's at all ages. And they also vary in how profound they are, and they span people of all age groups. And so we rely heavily on text. I have live captioning on everything. It's on TV. I complain, you know, if I go overseas and I can't watch a movie because it's not live captioned. I write to the airline and tell them. And live captions also they assist people, you know, who are not English first language. And it's really important to make it accessible. Zoom and Teams have live captioning available. Live captioning is available today, and it's often available on all media-based forms. And we also lip read, so please make sure your face is visible when you're speaking and well read. 1 in 5 people have a disability, and many presentations are less accessible for them. I'm still learning how to improve mine, and I've talked to some people about, and I've learned from others either on Twitter or on various platforms, and I'm happy to share what I've learned. And if anyone has any other things that I've missed, please contact me. I don't know it all. So in terms of improving accessibility for dyslexia people, and I'm acknowledging Trav for these tips. People with dyslexia prefer visual anchors and text without uneven word spacing. So I used to do everything centered in the middle. I love symmetry, and I've learned to get past that and present like this. So do not use center justified text, left only justified works much better. And also the font can be very different. I'm using Calibri here because this is a preferred font, and also leave lots of white space between sentences. And this is also applicable for grant applications unless specific rules prevent accommodating. So even though I do use a lot of text, and I do that deliberately because of my hearing loss and knowing how it will affect others with hearing loss, I use custom animation to bring out that text so it's not as dense as it is looking now. And color helps to reduce the blindness of our presentations, but it's also common, color blindness. So try and avoid colors that are hard for people. And if you use GraphPad Prism, and we do, it actually has an option you can generate, automatically choose to generate a color scheme that's accessible. And you can also manually choose colors. But this is in Prism. You have the option here to change the colors. You click on it and it opens up, and then here is, you've got your default graph in grey tones, and then there's a colorblind save option here, and this is what happens when you click on that. And you can change these colors as well if you want to, but I use these in my grants and most of my presentations these days when I use color. And if you're doing imaging studies, and we do in our lab, and you would have noticed that I had 2 images on my initial slide. This is the standard and accessible colorblind and accessible color palette. It shows different developing blood cells in the bone marrow, and also the endothelial cells here. And this is the same, which is accessible. And that doesn't look as contrasty to me. So what we do is, when we're publishing, we put the most contrasty in the main, but we also use supplemental figures to provide the colorblind friendly ones. And these are suitable for images, graphs, and figures. And then these are a couple of palettes. We've used this palette to generate the image at the right, and this is an additional palette for figures. And Gavin in my lab has generated these data and the palettes. There are people who have vision disabilities, and you know, this is a great thing about Zoom, is that it's enabled it to become much more accessible, and other platforms, virtual platforms, and they can use their screen readers. And so these screen readers help people with vision disabilities, particularly with text that they cannot read, and also with figures. So be aware of the size of your font. Please make sure it's large enough to read, especially on small computer screens. And pictures have an alt text option these days. And I've used that for all of the figures in my talk today. And what you do is you click on the picture in PowerPoint when preparing your talk. And so what that does is it brings up this alt text. So this here brings up an alt text option. And what you do is you write in there just a couple of sentences. I've written here a screenshot from GraphPad Prism, highlighting the option to change colors of graphs. So it's really up to you what you write, but it's something that's a bit more descriptive, and it enables them to understand what each figure is showing. and avoid using tables if possible. So other things to keep in mind to improve accessibility: light background colors with dark text are easier to read than dark backgrounds with light text. And flashing lights might look cool, especially in social media, but if you use them, you actually can trigger an epileptic episode, or you can adversely affect other people with neurological disabilities. And when giving face-to-face presentations, please always use a microphone. You might think that everyone can hear you, but I can guarantee there's at least one person who needs that microphone, and they shouldn't have to always say, yes, I do need a microphone. Speak clearly, do not mumble, and try not to talk too fast. And if people would not be able to follow your talk if the sound was off, many will not be able to follow it when the sound is on. So please think of that in guiding your own presentations. And it also applies not just to people with hearing loss, but people who have difficulty following accents, including those ESL people. So why is improving accessibility of your presentation important if you do not require it? Well, it makes a difference to those who do. And if you exclude them, you're excluding a significant portion of your audience, and not just people with disabilities either. It doesn't take much extra work, but you can benefit too, particularly ECRs. You might even get invitations to present elsewhere by someone who actually appreciated the fact that they could follow your talk more readily than other talks. And people are trained to simplify their presentations, yet little is done to improve accessibility, which often declines with this type of training these days. So finding a balance of both is the best way to proceed. But there's really not much out there on how you can improve accessibility like what I've presented today. And I always find that the more we are aware of different things, the more we can improve access for everyone and equity. And we all deserve to be treated equitably. So simple workplace adjustments can improve accessibility for disabled people. The ability to work from home, and the pandemic has really demonstrated this, and or part-time assist many who cannot physically be at work all the time. There are job access and employment assistance funds. They're easy to apply for, and they provide dollars for workplace adjustments. We get up to $6,000 a year for a live captioner who basically watches what Zoom does with the automated and changes the words as they're going along if it's not quite right. Hybrid seminars and conferences improve accessibility for many, and I really hope that this becomes the future of conferences and presentations. And adjustments are not hard to do, and they make a big difference to many. And most importantly, the most important thing you can do for any underrepresented person is to provide an environment where everyone feels safe and supported. Unfortunately, that's not quite the case at the moment. We're still waiting to be treated with equity in STEM, and this applies to all other underrepresented groups. And people are underrepresented in academia because of the inequities in the current system. It needs to change, and it's everyone's responsibility, not just those in the affected groups. There is no difference in our ability to do research. There's a lot of scientific evidence that that's no difference at all. However, there's a major difference in how we are supported, and that's very, very scientifically proven as well. And there is a lot of evidence, including our own in the gender equity, that bias is a major contributing factor to the lack of retention of underrepresented groups in academia. So please be aware of your bias, unconscious and conscious, and take accountability for the effects that you are having. And the data do show, and it's very, very well published now, that when a workplace is more diverse, there's more innovation and research excellence and a better culture. So the workplace profits from diversity and inclusivity. And I will continue to advocate and until we do achieve equity and for all underrepresented groups. So you haven't heard the last of me yet. So I'd just like to thank my role models. I've had a lot of wonderful women, and my dad and men and personal support groups throughout my life who have helped me to survive, and particularly in my tough times. And I've had a number. My personal thanks to my family and my lab members. While I'm not talking about gender equity today, it's not the topic. It's been a wonderful group of people, and just as being part of that, oops, as you can see here, we've achieved more than really what I thought we would, and to people who have helped me with versions of this talk on the way, and then of course my family. And the best roller coasters I go on are the ones that I go on with my boys. So thank you everyone for your attendance. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that, Louise. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought there.
I have to
I will
stop sharing.
I'll put my camera back
Thank
on. Let me see if I can do that.
Yes, I will be very happy to share the slides.
There we go.
So
thank you very much for that. I think some of the things that came up on the sidebar about how to make things more inclusive very early on, one of the questions that came up, but I think you've given us some ideas at the end. And if you're willing to share your slides with us, I think this would be an excellent presentation for more of the people who are lecturing and giving the basically are in the classroom first and second year students, because as you say, there's such a number now of students coming in and they may be not comfortable declaring their disability, that just making the slides more inclusive, as you say, we're making them simpler, but that actually may be more restrictive to them. And that's an interesting angle to put at when you come from two different sides of the education curriculum. So on the side, Emily's asked the question about how to maybe make it more comfortable, or is there a way to get people with disabilities get more of their experience being researchers, academics, etc. Do you have anything more to add to that?
So this is a really hard one, and like I say, the first time I gave this talk, and I was still suffering side effects from the steroids. I went through really nasty experience and withdrawal syndrome from the steroids because they gave me too high a dose. They gave me 3 times the amount that they probably should have. So I was actually a bit different to my normal person when I gave my first talk, but it was the most hardest talk that I've ever given in my life. I wasn't sure how it would be taken while I was giving it to my hematology research community in Australia. I also knew that there were people there who had treated me poorly. And so it's really partly an individual being able to get the courage to do it, and it can be really hard, and also making sure that they are in a safe environment, that they're supported in it. You know, just having even people say, look, I'm happy to go through your talk with you beforehand if you want me to, doing anything to make them realize that while it's hard, it does help. It helps promote awareness and it helps make people change. And I know that speaking out about my own career path and my own disability has made people think and has just changed some people, which is a really nice thing. So for me, I'm quite happy to do it, but it can be really hard to do. So, and don't expect everyone to do it, because not everyone is going to be able to.
Thank you for that. I've also read somewhere on the side about a conference that was in person only, and it was an autism research conference, which sort of seems to be an oxymoron, that you don't allow or don't have some inclusivity, especially when talking about people on the spectrum, people with diagnosed autism. That just sounds very disappointing. Anyways, other than advocacy that you've experienced where you can really help make a difference to organizations that are organizing these kinds of meetings?
Yeah, I think that if people are open to doing hybrids and putting these on Zoom or another platform that enables people to either watch it from home, or if it's recorded, to watch it later. Obviously, enabling live captioning is really important. A lot of people are not aware of that either. It's really easy to do on Zoom these days. There used to be a feature you had to pay for, but I'm not sure. I know it's now more openly available, which is great. So it's a case of, you know, if you're not thinking of that there are those people there, you're not going to cater for them because you're not aware of it. And so it's a case of not assuming that everyone is going to be comfortable with an in-person or going to be able to make an in-person meeting. And even if it is an in-person meeting, you can still do it as a hybrid event and enable people to do that. So I hope that answers that question.
Yes, and I think just having a voice, always, as you say, no matter how many times we get knocked back, just having a voice and saying, you know, this may or may not be my disability, but we can make it more inclusive by just doing these little things. Penny,
Yeah.
you've got your hand up.
Just making sure I turn on my camera first. I'm an openly autistic lecturer in the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine, and I've been open about that since I feel like about 10 years, because I gave my first talk about my experience 10 years ago. And you were saying at the beginning, near the beginning of your presentation, that you find the networking component of conferences tricky. I'm autistic and I also have sensory processing disorder. So the conference seminar style part of the event is fine, because you're in a room and listening to one person talking at a time. But I too find the networking lunch morning tea breaks difficult, because they're trying to cram lots of stuff in. So they only have 15 minutes sometimes for you to grab a bite to eat, go to the toilet because there's been a 2-hour session and there's about to be another 2 hours. But there's also lots of people catching up. So I find sensory-wise that time overwhelming, which at the end of the year is one reason why I didn't go to that in-person only autism event that wasn't even recorded to watch later. So I don't know who I should go to complain, to sort of rock it up the organisation and make sure it happens next time. But just wondering is how you manage the networking side of things at conferences.
For me, for my hearing, I find it impossible to network in a really noisy environment. Now I'm also getting invited to be a meet the professor. So I say, you know, I accept, but I need it to be in a quiet environment. And I can tell you that in a conference I was doing a breakfast session earlier in mid-year, no one, not even those with perfect hearing, could hear a thing in the room. And I think it's really important so that, you know, they were like looking at me and they're saying, well, Louise, you know, we understand what it's like for you because we can't understand a thing here. And you really do need to find good environments for networking. And I do think that what you've raised is amazing. Thank you for sharing that, because it really does. People don't think of these things, and it can be exhausting sometimes to put your hand up constantly and point them out. But it's so important until it becomes more the new normal, that people really are aware of those things. I always say to people, look, I can't hear in this loud environment. If you want to talk to me, can we go somewhere quieter, please? And I do think that that would be a great thing if they can make smaller rooms that are quieter, but are also safe. I mean, we also have to think about safety for people who find it harder in those really noisy environments to follow. I do think that for other networking sessions that are not a person-to-person thing, but, you know, an overall thing, to record them, like you said, I think that's really a great idea and important to do. And I think that, you know, the more of us, it's always hard because we're always doing the work and it takes more time to do the work. But until more people are aware of what the big issues are, we will continue to have to do the work to make it more accessible and enable everyone to get the most out of those things. But in the past, networking for me, I used to avoid them because I just couldn't hear.
The conference room, the downstairs conference rooms at 553 St Kilda Road are also have also got really, really bright lights. So not next Tuesday, but the following Tuesday, there's the end of year teaching symposium, which I really want to go to, but it's like, well, if I go to that for the morning, I'll have a really bad headache and I'll wipe out the rest of that day and probably the following day as well.
Yeah.
So if I want to go to the teaching thing, I will probably be rocking the sunglasses and the cap.
Yeah. I was just picking up on something that Penny's raised, and also you've raised, Louise, that often I think potentially we expect people living with a disability or neurodiversity to be the ones that are making the adaptations. You know, like you with your cochlear implants, and I think just maybe this is a comment more as people who want to be allies and people who have joined today and who are picking up the resources, hopefully, that we can put up and share with the GEDI website, that it's up to us to really take ownership and be the ones that are providing these options and opportunities rather than expecting them to be raised. And so maybe encouraging everyone to take that back away with them would be a really good idea as well. And maybe we can look as the GEDI committee to creating some resources to list these things. You know, what are the considerations we need for different people, of different diversities, all diversities? What are some considerations when organising conferences or talks or sessions, much like we've started to do with one of our checklists? So yeah, thank you very much for both of you for sharing your personal stories as well. And I think we're running short on time.
Yeah,
I don't know, Yagana, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, we are, but thank you, Louise. That was an amazing and enlightening talk. So thank you so much for that and sharing your personal, very personal experiences throughout your career. It made my and all of our experiences, I think, kind of, we could see where maybe things weren't exactly right, but maybe we didn't have the voice or didn't even understand, like you said, the female academic lead who didn't even understand some of the biases she was holding because of her own experiences, and then reflecting them on you. And I think that was very interesting to me, just reflecting on my career in science. So I would just like to personally thank you for making the time and coming out on this day. It would be amazing to see you in person or have this again at some point in the distant future, when we're all well enough and able to get together again. So that would be wonderful. And I think all of us, based on the sidebar, really learned something from this presentation. So thank you so much for being an advocate, not only for the disabled community, your own advocacy, but also women in science as well, because I think you touched on that. But today's not the day for that. So we'll talk about that another day as well. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you everybody for joining us in this presentation that just hosted by Zoom. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much. And feel free to contact me afterwards. I'll send you a copy of my slides as well.
Thanks
And thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks everyone for attending. Okay.
Thank you so much.